Okay, Rakshan, I think a few people have logged on, and I think they'll be pouring in sometime soon. So I guess you can take it away. You can get
Sure.
started.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Rakshana Ali. I'm the Program Specialist for the Master's in Data Analytics at the City University of New York School of Professional Studies. Our host today is Nathan Bastian. Here's a brief introduction on Nathan. Nathan is an adjunct professor of data analytics at the CUNY School of Professional Studies and a captain and healthcare operations research analyst in the U.S. Army Medical Department. As a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, Nathan is a PhD candidate in Industrial Engineering and Operations Research at the Pennsylvania State University. As a Fulbright Scholar to the Netherlands, Nathan earned a MS degree in Econometrics and Operations Research from Maastricht University. He's also a distinguished honor graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Here's Nathan.
Thank you for the introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I just want to thank CUNY for the opportunity to present today and to just share with the data science community and others just kind of what we're doing in terms of analytics in military healthcare and specifically in the Army. So again, I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation for their continual financial support, as well as the colleagues that have been on my team for a lot of the research efforts today. So the title is Using Decision Engineering to Support Management in Military Healthcare. And so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so this work discusses the employment of novel methods of multiple criteria decision engineering to assist strategic decision making and to support the complex planning and management of military healthcare resources, personnel, and logistics. So really, all of the methods discussed here are providing senior leaders within the military healthcare community with decision support tools to help make more informed and better decisions. So the primary motivation is the requirement to provide data-driven decision support to U.S. Army for optimizing resource allocation and performance within the military hospital network, workforce planning and future force structure with regards to our personnel, as well as supply chain network design for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief aerial delivery operations. Now, this is just a subset of the many problems that we've worked on, but I just wanted to highlight these three, given that we're covering kind of very much a fixed facility healthcare setting, our personnel, as well as our foreign assistance overseas. With all of these problems, there's multiple conflicting objectives facing the decision maker, and in most of the problems, there's inherent uncertainty that needs to be resolved. And so multi-criteria and stochastic optimization methods that leverage methods such as mixed integer programming, Monte Carlo simulation, discrete event simulation, clustering, regression modeling, etc., they're used and developed to provide critical insights for military decision makers. So let's get a little bit into an introduction with regards to, at a high level, these three problems. So the Department of Defense Military Health System, or MHS, is a large, centrally funded and controlled healthcare system that operates a $52 billion system and provides health services to over 4.5 million enrolled beneficiaries, which includes service members, family members, survivors, and retirees. And so there's a need for a new method of analysis to efficiently allocate or even reallocate resources to improve overall health system performance. And so due to rising healthcare costs, the military health system must balance our costs and access to care, satisfaction, quality, and workload so that we can help optimize this system. And so to do so requires careful management of major health system components. For those who don't know, the military health system is centrally funded, which means that dollars are sent to hospitals for expenditure, and the amount of money provided to each hospital varies based largely on historical expenditures. But the efficiency of hospitals within the military health system has recently gained a lot of attention from leaders, and so the concern for improving health system performance motivates this research. Another big problem deals with the U.S. Army Medical Department, or AMED, and they manage medical officer personnel over a 30-year time horizon. So the AMED was established in 1775, and there are 6 officer corps: the Medical Corps, the Dental Corps, the Nurse Corps, the Veterinarian Corps, the Medical Specialist Corps, and the Medical Service Corps. And each of them have been developed to provide organizational leadership and professional clinical expertise necessary to accomplish really a broad range of health service support functions. So there's over 100 different medical specialties in the Army Medical Department. The smallest is our Medical Specialist Corps with 4 specialties, which we call areas of concentration, or AOCs. And the largest is our Medical Corps, which has over 40 different medical specialties. And some of them are very complex. In the Medical Corps, you come in as maybe a general doctor, but then you transition potentially over years due to different training, and you may be a general doctor, but then become a radiologist and get more specialized training. And so there's definitely uncertainty in the transition, but there's also uncertainty in officer retention. So after an officer fulfills his or her active duty service obligation, there's really no say on when he or she is going to retire, get out, etc. And so there's complex uncertainty with regards to officer retention, as well as a large number of medical specialties. And so this creates a very complex problem with regards to determining the number of hires or promotions and personnel inventory. Another word for hires are what we call accessions. And so a lot of these decisions that are required to be made are stemmed by U.S. Congress, who has the DOTMA, which is, it's basically the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, which was established in 1980, and this provides guidance on promotion selection target percentages. And so we use this policy to drive our promotion decisions, but also as well as our hiring and the total personnel and inventory, to then provide decision support to our AMED Corps Chiefs. And the Corps Chiefs basically report to the Army Surgeon General for each of the 6 respective corps that I talked about. And so providing workforce planning to decision support to senior AMED decision makers and human resource planners is the problem at hand. And finally, the U.S. military responds to global natural disasters and provides humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This typically happens when the Department of State calls upon the Department of Defense to help provide assistance overseas. Typically, it's actually the U.S. Transportation Command, or U.S. Transcom, and they're typically responsible for planning and executing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief aerial delivery operations by providing assistance within a few days in the form of food and water, or what we call consumable aid. And so aerial delivery provides the primary means to rapidly supply the affected population within the first week following a disaster. The reason for this is often disasters can render normal ground lines of communication or transportation unusable for long periods of time. And so aerial delivery, or airdrop, is really the only mechanism for providing immediate aid. And we saw this, I believe it was last summer, with regards to some airdrop operations in the Middle East. And so this method safely delivers and disperses food and water directly to an affected population before the on-ground support arrives. And so there was a need for better strategic planning and resource allocation tools that optimize the military humanitarian assistance disaster relief aerial delivery supply chain network. So we're going to now get into the first topic, which is called multi-objective auto-optimization modeling for resource allocation decision-making in the military health system. So the application of resource allocation and performance measurement techniques to the military health system is a rarity. Really, there is no previous studies that addressed how MHS components are intrinsically linked in a complex, multi-objective fashion, so things like balancing quality and access and satisfaction as various objectives. Also, there is no decision support methods in existence for the automatic reallocation of resources. If you look down in any of our areas, for example, in San Antonio, where we have Army, Navy, Air Force, even VA facilities, why operate in a siloed environment when we can share resources that are fixed across facilities, in this case hospitals, to improve overall system performance? Well, no methods, and we're in existence to actually decide what those optimal reallocations should be. And finally, traditional efficiency measurement techniques. Some of you may have heard of data development analysis, which tries to create this virtual frontier, a virtual efficient frontier to serve as a benchmark for what we call decision-making units, which in this case could be hospitals. Stochastic frontier analysis, which uses econometric methods. And these two methods really don't provide decision makers clear recommendations on how to reallocate system input resources. And so these are some of the key motivations. So bottom line, we want to efficiently balance resources among hospitals in large health systems that are centrally controlled and funded while sustaining system output objectives. Senior military decision makers of the MHS seek to minimize inputs, specifically budgeted dollars, and full-time equivalent healthcare providers, while maintaining outputs constant, such as outpatient weighted workload, inpatient weighted workload, prevention metrics, access to care, and patient satisfaction. And so in fixed input health systems, such as the military health system, it becomes necessary to improve system performance by reallocating inputs among the existing decision-making units, as decision makers seek to rebalance funding and personnel across the system. And so doing so requires decision support to identify winners and losers. As previously mentioned, evaluation of slack and reduced costs in traditional multiple criteria mathematical programming and data development analysis models does not provide sufficient reallocation decision support. And so in this work, we leverage some structural similarities between these two multi-criteria decision-making methods and develop a hybrid resource allocation-based model that helps the decision maker balance competing objectives automatically. So we're going to get into a little bit of math, but not too much. So let's get into some notation. So we have some indices, I representing our, in this case, our decision-making units or our hospitals. We have J for our outputs, and we have K for our inputs. And we have three key decision variables. Our first one, delta Ki, is saying how much we want to adjust to each input K by a hospital I. And then we have weights for output J in each hospital I, as well as weights for each input K in hospital I. And then our data, we have inputs for data, which is xki, and outputs, which is yji. So that's pretty simple notation. And so this is the formulation. I'll kind of brief this at a high level. So the objective function here seeks to optimize the sum of the efficiencies for all the hospitals. And here they're the weighted outputs. Then we have this global efficiency lower bound, which exists between 0 and 1. And this constraint is important, as one could imagine the objective function seeking to reduce the efficiency of one hospital to near 0 in order to make the others near 1. So this is ensuring that doesn't happen. Then we have to ensure that our weighted outputs are no greater than our weighted inputs after the inputs are automatically adjusted across the hospitals. Then we have to force the sum of our weighted and reallocated inputs to unity. And this constraint says, well, our remaining adjusted inputs must be non-negative. So our original inputs here, after reallocating them up or down, that new reallocated amount must be non-negative. And finally, we can't grow resources for reallocation. So what's novel here is we're shifting resources such as funding or staffing between decision-making units, but that total shift must sum to 0. So we can't grow new resources. And finally, we have some non-negativity and other constraints. So that's a high-level view of the math behind the model. And so this model provides decision support regarding the automatic adjustment of all system inputs. And so we have staffing of providers and allocation of funding, and those are inputs into our model. And so to test this, we first validated the performance of our model against the traditional approach known as data development analysis, or DEA. And we just used at first a simple textbook problem. And this just had 7 hospitals, 3 inputs, and 4 outputs. And using DEA, this suggested reduction in input resources for 1 hospital. Well, that's not possible. It's infeasible for fixed input systems. So in DEA, you try to manipulate your inputs to meet the efficient frontier, but why not reallocate those inputs to another hospital to then optimize overall system performance as well as that individual hospital? And that's what the model's doing here. And it's such the case that we actually achieved 100% efficiency in all hospitals via reallocation of inputs across the hospitals. And so then we jump to a real world problem where we use 16 US Army hospitals in the military health system from 2003. Now this analysis has been done with current data as well, but this was just to show, we didn't want to show any data that was recent here. So our main inputs that we're looking at are a population measure, looking at an enrollment population supported by the hospital. Now this is an input to the efficiency of a hospital, but we can't move it around. We can't reallocate it, so it's non-discretionary. Our 2 discretionary inputs are worker measure, which is looking at our assigned full-time equivalent, in essence staffing, and then our cost measure of funding, which is our expenditure of less training and readiness costs. And then we have 5 outputs of interest here, our competing objectives dealing with an inpatient workload measure, an outpatient workload measure, a quality, satisfaction, and access measure. So those are our output in the model. And so when running traditional DEA, and specifically looking at variable returns to scale, it resulted in 10 inefficient decision-making units. So that means 10 that did not have efficiency scores of 1. If we went back, you'd notice that the model presented here is actually a nonlinear model because we're multiplying decision variables by each other, thus creating a quadratic term in the constraints. And so in this case, we used multiple nonlinear programming solvers in a modeling language known as GAMS, the General Algebraic Modeling System, to compare solution sets. And regardless of the solver used, all hospitals achieved efficiency scores of 1, so 100%, by reallocating cost and FTEs or staffing input resources. And so here's just the data, I just want to show one example. So we can see here with Hospital 1, these were original costs, and these were original staffing, and you can see after reallocation how we decreased our funding and we increased our FTEs for this solver, and similar results for the other 2 solvers. But what we wanted to see was there congruency across the solvers, and we did find that 11 out of the 16 hospitals had identical directionality changes for FTEs. So that was good news. Fortunately, the use of an actual nonlinear programming method actually is beneficial because it shows that there may be multiple optimal solutions to achieving 100% efficiency across the system for all hospitals. But there may be constraints, and whether it be infrastructure or other things that aren't accounted for in the model, that a decision maker can then see the trade-offs of the different solutions, each yielding an optimal efficiency, but maybe it's not smart to move staffing from here to there, et cetera, et cetera. So the multiple solution approach from the nonlinear programming actually plays to our favor. And so the necessity to efficiently balance and reallocate input resources among hospitals is really paramount in the military health system, especially now with rising costs, a motivation to improve value of healthcare delivered, in this case quality and access to care and satisfaction, et cetera. And so this model is novel in the sense that it's a multi-objective decision engineering tool that's an alternative to the current performance measurement approaches, but it's unique in that it adjusts system inputs automatically. And so this is really, really good. So next I want to talk about optimizing U.S. Army Medical Department workforce planning decisions using goal programming. And so effective long-term workforce planning and personnel management of officers within the Army Medical Department is a complex problem. Previously, the Army Personnel Proponent Directorate, or APPD, they previously used a manual approach to project the appropriate hires and promotion goals for each medical specialty across the 6 corps. Well, using the manual approach is very time-consuming and makes what-if analysis almost impossible, but definitely very impractical. So this was one motivation. Also, previous studies didn't address multiple objectives with regards to manpower planning in the presence of uncertainty. And in this case, we're looking at officer retention or continuation. And finally, the methods that we employ in this study, we actually compare two stochastic goal programming methods of Monte Carlo simulation-based approximation and sample average approximation. And in the literature, this had not been done previously, especially within the context of workforce planning. So these are some motivations. But the bottom line is the key desire from the AMED decision makers was to provide a decision support to determine the appropriate number of hires and promotions and personnel inventory under uncertainty to support a 30-year life cycle, which is the life cycle that we track for an officer from second lieutenant all the way through 06, which is a colonel. And so we developed the objective force model, or OFM. And there's 3 components. One is the deterministic mixed integer linear weighted goal programming. The second is a stochastic variant, which uses 2 stochastic optimization solution methods that involve sampling. And finally, we use a discrete event simulation to verify and validate the results. And so the bottom line is we wanted a tool to effectively project the necessary workforce structure by grade. And so here we see we have second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and captains. And in the example we're going to show here for the medical specialist corps, these are the 3 ranks in which they're hired or assessed. And then we're looking at promotion decisions from captain to major, major to lieutenant colonel, and lieutenant colonel to colonel. So let's first discuss the deterministic variant of the OFM, or the objective force model. And so we have some sets for the representing the officer's grade, the officer's career specialty, or AOC, the officer's year in service, K, as well as decision maker goals, which I'll talk to in a sec. In this smallest example, as I said before, with the medical specialist corps, we're only dealing with 4 career specialties, or AOCs, and we're looking at occupational therapists, physical therapists, clinical dietitians, and physician assistants. Then we have several parameters. The key ones I want you to look at are we have what's called documented authorizations. In simple terms, these are basically funded positions for each AOC and each grade. We then, in this example, we have a deterministic continuation rate for each AOC, grade, and year. We have bounds on the number of the quantity of officers in the system for specific specialties, as well as for specific specialties at specific grades. We have minimum and maximum promotion rates for the specialties at specific grades. And then we have these 3 immaterial authorizations. One is called the Medical Specialist Corps Immaterial Authorizations, and these are basically positions that are they're immaterial to any medical specialist corps officer. So regardless of your AOC, you can fulfill this slot. Then you have AMED immaterial authorizations, and these are any Army Medical Department officer can fulfill this slot. And then finally, you have those that are transient, holdees, and student authorizations. And finally, we have our decision variables. We're trying to determine the number of officers promoted in a specific AOC at a specific grade. Again, here we're looking at from captain to major, major to lieutenant colonel, and lieutenant colonel to colonel. And then we're looking at the number of officers hired for each AOC and grade. And again, we're managing hiring for second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and captains. And finally, we have decision variables for the officer quantity in the system, as well as the projected officer inventory for each grade, for each career specialty, and for each year. And then we have these deviation variables, which I'll talk about in a sec. So let's get into the model. We have these positive and negative deviation variables basically what they are is the decision maker sets a target, and instead of having a hard constraint, we relax the hard constraint, like less than or equal to or greater than equal to, and we allow deviations from this hard constraint. And so what we want to do is we want to penalize this deviation. So I'll discuss this a little bit more. So we have goal constraints. At the high level, what we're trying to do is balance the number of officers and documented authorizations in terms of total and grade. So, and we have 5 goal constraints. The first one is saying that our total number of officers in the system, we want that to equal the total number of authorizations. So these are our funded positions plus the immaterial positions, as well as those transients, holdies, and students. So we want these to balance. And so then we have that's not just for total, but also for colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors. And finally, we want this balance to occur for what we call company grade officers, which are second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and captains. So those are our goal constraints. Then we have some officer quantity floors and ceilings. We have officer promotion bounds. And then we have various inventory transition controls, non-negativity, integrality constraints. As this is a big, in essence, a multi-period inventory problem, in this case, the inventory is people. So let's discuss our solution methods for the stochastic optimization problems. So we have officer continuation rates from historical data, and these happen to be normally distributed, which was nice. And so what we want to do is we want to approximate the expected value of the objective function, given some realizations here psi, and we want to pick the minimum. And so what we do is we generate S scenarios, and each scenario S, or little s, maps to one realization of psi. So let me point it out this way. We do one sample of the officer continuation rates, and then we use that, we plug it in, and now we have in essence a deterministic objective force model optimization problem, and we solve it. And we do that S times, okay? And so now we have S deterministic optimization problems with the following form. We want to minimize X in the set X of the following function, given each realization of the random officer continuation rates from I equals 1 to S. And then we let Zi be the minimal value, and then we let Xi be the solution to that. And then we just take the average over all scenarios for both, giving a Z bar and X bar. So that's really what scenario-based Monte Carlo simulation is doing. And so we solve the deterministic objective force model for each scenario with stochastically generated continuation rates. And then the final approximated objective function value and the optimal solution of the stochastic goal program is the sample average over the scenarios. So that's the one solution methodology. The second one is known as sample average approximation, which is similar, but there's a unique difference. So again, we're formulating the stochastic goal program to approximate the following. We want to minimize the expected value of the objective function. But now this time, suppose we have psi1 to psi n are n independent and identically distributed samples, okay? And then what we want is we want to get an unbiased estimate of f of x, because in the end we want to minimize over x f of x. But due to the stochastic nature of retention rates, we're minimizing the expected value. And so what we want to do is we want to minimize the sample average to obtain an estimate of the optimal value. So for each value, psi1 to psi n, we plug it into the function, and we do the n times, and we take the average. Then we want to minimize that sample average. So we want to minimize the sample average to get the Zn hat, which is exactly that. But then we model this, so let's say there's n to the 1,000 samples. We take the mean or the sample average over 1,000 samples, but then we want to iterate that for a certain number of times, for m times. And so we reiterate the sample average approximation program m times. The easy way to think of this is, let's say I sample from some distribution, I sample 1,000 samples, and I take the average. And I take 1,000 samples, and I take the average. And I do that 100 times. So then I have 100 sample average values. And it turns out that the expected value of the sample averages, i.e. the expected value of the distribution of sample means, is an unbiased estimate of the population mean. So that's really what we're doing here. And then we can also compute the standard error and compute bounds, in essence, or variance on our decision variables. And so that's what we're doing here. We iterate the sample average program m times, and so we get this value here, VNM. And we can also estimate the variance, and it turns out that the expected value of Zn hat, that VNM is an unbiased estimate of this expected value, which turns out to be a lower bound on our true objective function if there was no uncertainty, Z star. So that's a little high-level view of what's going on here. And finally, to verify and validate the deterministic objective force model, we developed a discrete event simulation model that processes specialist corps officer hires for each AOC through the 30-year life cycle. Here's just a simple overview or process flowchart of what's happening. Basically, we track the hiring as a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, and we map them through a 30-year life cycle. And there's key probabilistic decisions such as, is the entity promoted? Does the entity continue to the end of the year? And this discrete event simulation model uses the officer promotion rates and the number of officer hires determined from the deterministic optimization model. And then we also use the empirical distribution for the officer continuation rates within the simulation. And finally, this model is replicated 999 times using what's known as common random number streams to help with variance reduction. So we used real-world data from the AMED Personnel Proponency Directorate, or APPD, to parameterize both the optimization and simulation models. And here's just a high-level overview of some of the data, the documented authorizations, our bounds, our promotion rates, etc. But the key takeaway here is this tool. This simple histogram is our workforce management decision support tool. And so currently, APPD uses these results to generate histograms that visually represent the current workforce inventory, which are partitioned by the fiscal year that the officer entered active duty, plotted against the 30-year life cycle inventory as projected by the objective force model. So here's an example for physical therapists. The vertical bars of the histogram represent the actual inventory in terms of the primary year group and rank. The black line here, this is the objective force model target, and this represents the results of the objective force model projection. We see here that given that the bars are the actual inventory in the system, so these are our number of lieutenants in the system, these are a number of captains, these are a number of majors, these are a number of lieutenant colonels, and these are a number of colonels. Well, our black line, or our black curve, represents what we should have. And so currently our senior leaders and human resource planners use this as a tool to see, hey, where are we potentially over strength and where are we potentially under strength? And depending on the current situation, such as now where we have a workforce reduction program, who do we potentially need to target with either decisions to lay off part of the force, or do we need incentives to keep provide better incentives for retainment? But it's used as a tool to help make some of these key managerial decisions. And so it's very, very useful for looking at a way to provide management focus and key personnel decisions. And APPD periodically updates these histograms as personnel numbers change during the year and whenever a new objective force model is produced, which is usually annually. So we use, as I mentioned, discrete event simulation to verify and validate the results. And so what we get here is, from the simulation, we get an average by AOC and by grade or rank. We get the number of that specific officer in the system. We get its standard deviation, and then we compute its confidence interval half width. And then this is the actual data from the optimization model. And so when we put them together, we see optimal value is our optimization model, and upper and lower bounds produced by the simulation, and we see here that only in 2 cases here in blue are we slightly outside the bounds produced by the simulation. So this showed pretty good, this was very good validation of the optimization model. And also, when plugging in the 2 stochastic variants of the model, the results were extremely similar. So given that even when modeling uncertainty with different variances and et cetera for the officer continuation rates, the results were similar to our assumptions made in the deterministic model. It turns out the deterministic model is a lot easier to solve, as we can use Excel and Visual Basic for applications, macros, and things like that to automate it, which helps with the what-if analysis. And so given the deterministic results were very similar to stochastic ones, this proved really useful, especially for our larger cores, such as the medical core with 41 different career specialties. As you said, it's a very complex problem, and so this was great validation as well as verification. So these results validate and verify our results, as I said, for optimal manpower planning in the medical specialist corps. And so the objective force model described is currently in use by APPD for long-term workforce planning of medical professionals in the AMID. The expert workforce management decision support for estimating the proper number of hires and promotions necessary to achieve desired personnel structure under uncertainty is in itself of significant importance. The model requires only seconds to solve rather than months. It identifies specific primary year groups for hiring, promoting, firing, etc., and it's been pivotal in the workforce reduction program. Okay, now I'm on to the last topic, looking at multi-criteria cost assessment and logistics modeling for military humanitarian assistance and disaster relief aerial delivery operations. A decision support model was needed to facilitate both responsive and efficient military HAJDR logistics planning. No previous studies investigated the optimization of military HAJDR logistics in terms of aerial delivery operations. Further, no previous studies tackled military supply chain network design optimization under the presence of uncertainty and under multiple conflicting objectives. And finally, no previous studies assessed the trade-offs between supply chain efficiency and supply chain responsiveness under uncertainty. So these are some of the key motivators. Bottom line, provide a strategic decision support to the U.S. Army Native Soldier Research and Development and Engineering Center for the aerial delivery of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, consumable aid. The key is optimizing the military HAJDR aerial delivery supply chain network so that decision makers at USAID and US Transcom can understand the supply chain trade-offs with regards to efficiency and responsiveness. So we developed the multi-criteria decision analysis framework using stochastic mixed integer weighted goal programming, clustering analysis and regression modeling, Monte Carlo simulation, and design of experiments. This framework was used to optimize network design, logistics costs, staging locations, procurement, and inventory levels. To answer some key questions, how many staging locations and which ones should be open to pre-positioned consumable aid for distribution to disaster areas via several aerial delivery modes? How much consumable aid should be procured from the suppliers, as well as stored in inventory at both depots and staging facilities? And finally, how many trips are necessary between the different supply chain stages for each of the different pre-positioned aerial delivery modes to achieve a best compromise solution across the conflicting criterion under uncertainty? So in the event of natural disasters, the military HAJDR aerial delivery planners must make a series of quick decisions. The process flow at a very high level looks like this. You have consumable aid purchased from vendors, which is then transported from the vendors to supply depots, which are mostly in the United States, or stateside, where this consumable aid is stored. It is then transported from the depots to pre-positioned staging locations around the world. It's stored there, and then in the event that a HAJDR event occurs, aerial delivery capability is immediately prepared to conduct the HAJDR mission packing, loading, etc., so then that there's mission execution, and then the consumable aid is transported via the aerial delivery capability and then airdropped to the affected population. Upon notification of a foreign disaster event, the aerial delivery capability is immediately prepared for mission execution, and the consumable aid is transported and airdropped to the affected population. This is just a high-level overview of the supply chain network, where you have suppliers or vendors, warehouses, distribution centers, such as our pre-positioned storage facilities, disaster areas, which are uncertain in terms of location and demand, as well as aerial delivery modes. Here we're looking at C-17, C-130s, as well as CH-47 Chinook helicopters. So in the MCDA framework, we incorporate several modeling methodologies to provide a robust decision support tools. First, we use goal programming. As you've seen a little bit now, this allows decision makers to systematically explore and examine different optimization problem criteria. We also use design of experiments to estimate the impact of the underlying factors and their interaction causing uncertainty within the system. And finally, we use stochastic optimization to incorporate random elements into the model, objective function, and the data parameters. There are some key optimization model assumptions. First, each aerial delivery mode transports its maximum allowable capacity per trip, and all consumable aid on board is delivered. Also, each aerial delivery mode that's pre-positioned is capable of traveling the full distance required. So there's uncertainty with regards to stops that may need to make en route for an asset, but they are assumed to be made. Example, if they need to refuel. And there's no limit on the number of hours flown for each aerial delivery mode, and this is specifically looking at maintenance. The decision maker may place a flight time budget or something on the hours, and that can be factored into the model. And finally, all pre-positioned aerial delivery assets are available to be used to deliver aid. So what this means is a lot of these assets are already pre-positioned at U.S. Air Force bases around the world, and they're given a secondary mission to conduct HAJDR aerial delivery operations. So it's assumed that they're available to be used in the event mission execution is called upon. So let's get a little bit into the model. We have some sets looking at our suppliers, our warehouses, distribution centers, high-risk disaster areas or beneficiaries, which I'll talk about how we determine those, aerial delivery modes. Then we have disaster planning scenarios, which are based on some impact factors. This is where we use a 2 to the 3 full factorial design of experiments looking at disaster impact, days of food needed to be provided, as well as a supply chain disruption factor that affects the cost. And then we also have to map each of these scenarios to a specific disaster area being affected. And so those are our model iterations. Then we have a lot of parameters. I'll try to keep it short here. We have the probability of occurrence for each planning scenario. We have supply chain disruption effect on costs, days worth of food, disaster impact. We have an expected demand that occurs at each disaster area and each scenario and iteration. We then have geodesic distances, cruise speed, loads, and travel times, as well as various and uncertain or probabilistic operation maintenance costs, amount of aid transported, transportation costs, inventory holding costs, procurement costs, capacities, and fixed costs. And then we have decision maker goal targets. Our decision variables here are, do we open a facility or not? Whether or not a disaster area is served by a particular storage facility, the number of trips between a storage facility and disaster area, the number of trips between a depot and a storage facility, the amount of aid purchased from a vendor for storage at a particular stateside depot, the amount of inventory to store at both the storage facility and the depot, as well as our goal deviation variables. So let's get a little bit into the model. Again, we're looking to minimize the expected sum of goal deviations. So we want to minimize not meeting each of the goals, and it is weighted. And so the decision maker provides a weight. We have 3 main goals here. We want to minimize our total aerial delivery, in essence, response time, which factors into the time between depot and storage facility, as well as storage facility and beneficiary. So it's a total aerial delivery time. We also want to minimize our total supply chain costs, and we want to minimize the amount of estimated demand unmet. Then we have set partitioning assignment constraints. We have inventory constraints at each stage of the supply chain network, bounds on the number of trips between stages, backfill and procurement constraints, and a flight time budget. Finally, we have our binary integer and non-negativity decision variable constraints. So we performed a computational experiment using the tool for strategic level military HAJDR supply chain network design optimization. In this example, we had 3 consumable aid vendors or suppliers. We had 2 consumable aid depots or warehouses located at U.S. Marine Corps logistics bases in both Georgia and California. And we also had 10 candidate storage facilities or distribution centers located at U.S. Air Force bases in both the United States and various locations overseas. And finally, based on some analysis, we determined 8 foreign disaster areas or beneficiaries. So for data parameterization, we use Monte Carlo simulation because a lot of the costs and travel distances and those key things were based on subject matter recommendations from the decision maker and had some uniform distribution of minimum and maximums. Then we used k-means and hierarchical clustering based on 20 years of global disaster data from the Emergency Events Database, or EMDAT, which is maintained by the Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disaster at Louvain University, and it's supported by USAID. And so we use clustering methods with variables such as disaster frequency, mortality rates, total number of affected, total economic damages, to determine the number of clusters needed. Based on the realism of the problem and some of criteria for determining the appropriate number of clusters, 8 clusters, in this case 8 disaster areas or beneficiaries, were determined. And these are in Haiti, Indonesia, Mexico, Tanzania, India, China, Australia, and Peru. And then we use multiple regression methods to estimate the total number of affected people per year, which was used to compute the expected consumable aid demand. Box-Cox transformations were needed, coupled with 5-fold cross-validation with best subset selection to determine the best predictive model, and robust standard errors were used to correct for non-constant variance. So it turns out that 8 of the 10 candidate storage facilities are opened, which makes sense due to set partitioning constraints for pre-positioning both aerial delivery assets and consumable aid inventory. We see here, which it's very hard to see, but bottom line is U.S. Air Force bases in Kuwait and Honduras should not be opened as part of the optimal supply chain network designs. Turns out that on average, the supply chain network took 6 days roughly for total aerial delivery response time, $153 billion of total supply chain cost, and 47 million pounds of total demand shortage. And obviously these can be, we can change these based on weights determined by a decision maker. Then we use sample average approximation, as discussed previously, to construct statistical lower and upper bounds, or 95% confidence intervals, on the consumable aid inventory to store at depots, storage facilities, and to procure from vendors. And these are just some of the ranges for the response times, costs, and shortages. The key takeaways here, looking at the trade-offs between supply chain efficiency and effectiveness. These are by criteria. So on the x-axis here is response time and cost. Here we have one non-dominated solution, which basically says, hey, this is lowest in response time and lowest in cost. So these points are all dominated. Here's the trade-off between response time and demand unmet, and we see there's various non-dominated solutions. Here's a dominated point because we can achieve a shorter response time and less cost. So this point here is dominated. And between demand unmet and supply chain cost, we see there's a clear linear trade-off. So the decision support tool facilitates both responsive and efficient logistics planning under uncertainty. The MCDA framework incorporated several methodologies to provide robustness and mitigate uncertainty in the system. This enabled the decision maker to exploit the supply chain network design trade-offs of average total aerial delivery response time, total supply chain cost, and amount of demand unmet. So some future work, we're looking at building upon the first model presented to develop what we call a fuzzy decision engineering model that can be used for the automatic resource reallocation with respect to different levels of risk preferences of the decision makers. This is work in progress. And second, we're using data and development analysis and econometric modeling to analyze whether a healthcare incentive model, in this case a pay-for-performance program implemented by the U.S. Army, decreased hospital efficiency in order to stimulate patient quality, access, and satisfaction improvements. So the novel multi-objective decision engineering models described in this research focus on the management of military healthcare, dealing with scarce health system resources, military personnel and healthcare personnel with regards to workforce planning and force structure, in military healthcare logistics, humanitarian logistics network design. The challenge, however, remains in careful coordination with senior military decision makers so that the models proffered here are used effectively as decision support tools. Fortunately, most of the models were developed in conjunction with these senior leaders, so we're on to a good start. Here are some references to 3 papers that were discussed today. And finally, I'd like to close with just the Master of Science program in Data Analytics at CUNY School of Professional Studies. For more information, you can visit the following website, or you can contact the appropriate representative via email or the following phone number. So with that said, I guess I'll leave the next 10 minutes or so for questions. Thank you.
Nathan, thank you very much. This is Andy Catlin. I'm Interim Program Manager for CUNY's MSDA program. I'd like to mention that Nathan will be teaching simulation and modeling this fall and optimization in spring 2016. Nathan, Ted Carr asked, does your model account for integration with an agency such as USAID?
Yeah, so I assume you're referring to the last model. It definitely can. So in dealing with NADIC, or NSRDEC, who is the client in this project, they were supposedly working as part of this HOPE project, Humanitarian Operations something, that was in conjunction with USAID, and as well as Transcom. We were trying to schedule a meeting, but it never happened. So can it be integrated? Absolutely. It's a very flexible, robust model that I built in Excel that uses some more advanced optimization solvers. But yes, it can be integrated. So.
If other people have questions, please type them into the chat window. Nathan, I'd like to ask, in addition to Excel, which you've clearly done some wonderful things with, are there other applications and tools that you'd recommend for data scientists who are starting out building optimization models for their organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the open source kind of era that we're in, I'm an avid user and programmer in both R as well as Python. So for almost 100% of my statistical analysis, especially if it's dealing with prediction or data mining, even optimization, I use R. But for more algorithmic type optimization, whether it be heuristics or even like linear programs, things like that, I can use Python. It just depends on the client and the user. A lot of the methods I use, because R and Python require you to put optimization models basically in matrix form. And for small problems, it's easy to do. But for very big, complex problems, it's a lot harder. So a lot of times it's better to use something like GAMS or Ample or Cplex or whatever for that framework. But you can do those things in Python as well as R. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. Nathan, thanks for a very informative talk, and appreciate everyone making the time, and I learned a lot about optimization today.
Good to hear, Andy. Thank you.
So if people have further questions, please send us an email. We can answer them. We certainly would love to answer any questions about the program if you're interested in learning more about how CUNY's master's degree in data science works. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.